Welcome to this study of the book of Colossians. The title of the course is Completeness in Christ, and this is Lesson 1 entitled Introduction. I am your instructor, Philip Giorgio of Giorgio Ministries, and I can be found at www.giorgioministries.com. The textbook for this course is the 21st Century Biblical Commentary Series book entitled The Books of Philippians and Colossians, Joy and Completeness in Christ by Robert Gramacki. In addition to the textbook, I will be referencing a suite of resources including study Bibles and commentaries, some of which are shown here in this slide. Here is the complete syllabus for the 11 lessons of the course. Each lesson, except for this first one, which covers the entire book, will provide commentary on the range of Colossian verses specified on the right. All 95 verses in all 4 chapters of Colossians will be covered. This is the structured outline for Lesson 1, Introduction. It contains 3 sections. The first section is the lesson preview, which provides an introduction and summary of this lesson. The second section is the letter basics, which describes the letter metadata. For example, who wrote the letter and to whom was it written. The third and final section is the overview section, which presents a brief survey of the entire book of Colossians, including the time and place of the writing, the purposes for writing, and the distinctives of the letter. This is the preview for Lesson 1. It is sourced from the Spirit-filled Life Student Bible. The Apostle Paul wrote Colossians and 3 other letters, Ephesians, Philippians, and Philemon, while awaiting trial in Rome around AD 61. The 4 books are sometimes referred to as Paul's prison epistles or Paul's prison letters. Paul had never visited the Colossian church. The troubling news he received about them caused him to write and remind them about the truth about Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. I will be exploring just what troubling news Paul received and exactly what truth Paul shared with the Colossian believers later in this lesson. Also later, I will go a little deeper into the geography of Colossae in the Lycus River Valley region. This slide shows the basic elements of the letter to the Colossians, using a modern snail mail letter motif, that is, an envelope with an actual letter. The envelope contains who it is from in the top left-hand corner, in this case the Apostle Paul, to whom is it addressed in the center, here the Colossian believers in the church at Colossae, and the actual letter which is contained within the envelope. In our motif, the actual letter is the overview section of our lesson. And this overview section presents the time and place of writing, just why did Paul write this letter, for what purpose or purposes, what are the distinctives of the letter, and what are some of the associated metrics associated with the letter. Section 2 of our lesson is focused on the letter basics. Who wrote the letter, or profile on the Apostle Paul, and who was the original audience of the letter, a profile on the church at Colossae. First, we'll concentrate on Paul the Apostle, the author of the Colossian letter. The Apostle Paul was born in Tarsus, near the Lebanese border in modern Turkey. He was a Roman citizen and a prominent Jewish religious leader, highly educated as a Pharisee. He persecuted Christians before his own dramatic conversion in AD 37, as recorded in Acts chapter 9. He's known for his tireless work to the Gentiles, and he was imprisoned by Nero's regime in AD 67 in Rome And we see that in 2 Timothy chapter 4, where he was executed the next year. This slide presents a timeline of the Apostle Paul's life. Notice, according to this source, the book of Colossians was written somewhere between AD 60 and 61, and some sources have this as late as AD 63. Also notice on this timeline, the Apostle Paul was born in AD 5. He was persecuting Christians between AD 30 and 35 before he had his conversion in AD 37. And as recorded in Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 19. He had 3 major missionary journeys, the first of which was in AD 47 to 49, followed immediately on his second missionary journey, AD 49 to AD 51, and his third missionary journey starting in AD 52 to AD 57. Notice that his first letter written by Apostle Paul was the Galatian letter written AD 49. And his second letter was the 1st and 2nd Thessalonians letter written in AD 51. 1st and 2nd Corinthian letters were written in AD 56, followed by the Romans letter, which was written in AD 57. He was arrested in AD 57 in Jerusalem. He wrote the prison letters of Philemon, Ephesians, Colossians, and Philippians, all about the same year, AD 60 to 61. Seems Philippians a year later in AD 62. He wrote the First Timothy letter in AD 62 to AD 63, the Titus letter in AD 63. He was released from prison in either AD 62 or AD 63, and he wrote his final letter to 2 Timothy, letter written in AD 67. He was imprisoned again in AD 67 in Rome, and it shows here it's Paul's death in AD 64 to 68. Obviously, these top 2 dates here are assuming Paul's death of AD 68. Now, if you look at other sources, you'll probably get different dates, slightly different dates for each of these, but this is a good source here that we'll use this as our basis. Now we'll look at the original audience of the letter to the Colossians, the recipients, the Colossian believers in the church at Colossae. First, I'll concentrate on the city of Colossae, a little geography and a little history. The city of Colossae was situated on a rocky ridge overlooking the valley of the Lycus River that runs through this mountainous district. Here we see Lycus River on the map. It was located about 100 miles east of Ephesus and about 11 miles slightly southeast of Laodicea. For a little bit of context here on the map, in the bottom right-hand corner we have Jerusalem in Israel. In the top left portion of the map we have Italy and Rome. This is all of Italy. We have Thessalonica, Philippi, and Corinth in the center here. This is Greece. And the cities of Ephesus and Colossae were in the region of Anatolia, which today we would call that modern-day Turkey. Now, in the 5th century BC, during the Persian Wars, Colossae was an important city, but as its companion cities Laodicea and Hierapolis grew, it declined. So you see here the orientation of Laodicea to Colossae and its orientation to Hierapolis, which is due north of Laodicea. However, even in its decline, Colossae did retain some mercantile value because it was one of the stops on the trade route to the east, and because glossy black wool was provided by shepherds in the adjoining hills. As we can see here on the map, Colossae was nestled here within these adjoining hills where the shepherds were raising the black glossy wool that was necessary or valuable for trade. Now, the eastern trade routes would start here in the port cities of either Smyrna or Ephesus. For the Smyrna originating eastern route, you would go Smyrna, Sardis, Philadelphia, Hierapolis, Laodicea, all the way out to the east. through Apamea. The eastern trade route originating in Ephesus, you would start with Ephesus, you would go through Laodicea, no stops through Hierapolis, but through Laodicea and out to Apamea. Now, each of the eastern trade routes, there were stops here on Colossae for that black wool. Also at Laodicea, you could have a decision point to go eastward trade, or you can go southward trade. Now, obviously, if you go in the southward trade route, you would not go through Colossae. Colossae was on the eastern trade route. In addition here, Hierapolis was known for its hot springs, and Colossae was known for its cool waters. And in the book of Revelation, there's a reference to Laodicea, where the Lord referenced that he preferred hot or cold, but that Laodicea was lukewarm. And here is the reference to the two sister cities of Laodicea, which is Hierapolis, which is the hot springs, versus Colossae with the cool water. And Laodicea was identified as being lukewarm. A very short history regarding the city of Colossae. An earthquake destroyed the city during the reign of Nero, but it was quickly rebuilt. Today the ancient site lies in ruins, with a modern town, Kronos, located nearby. And here I have a thumbnail sketch of Nero. He was a Roman emperor from AD 54 to 68. He was the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors to rule the Roman Empire. His 14-year reign represents everything decadent about that period in Roman history. He was self-indulgent, cruel, and violent, as well as a cross-dressing exhibitionist. His lavish parties, combined with the burning of Rome, continued the economic chaos that had plagued the Roman citizenry since the days of Tiberius. He committed suicide after being deserted by the Praetorian Guard and sentenced to death by the Senate. And here I'm showing The Fire of Rome by Hubert Robert. It's a painting from 1785. And this was the Great Fire of Rome that began on the night of 18 to 19 in July of AD 64. And here on the left, I'm showing the Julio-Claudian dynasty of the Roman Empire. This is basically a simplified family tree, starting out with Julius Caesar, who was dictator from 100 or from 49 to 44 BC. And we have Octavian, who defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, their combined forces to attain the emperorship, to be the first emperor of Rome. And following Octavian, who changed his name to Augustus, by the way, the second emperor of Rome was Tiberius, and then there was Caligula and Claudia, and finally Nero. So that is the family tree from Julius Caesar down to Nero. The original audience of the letter of Colossians, the recipients, were the Colossian believers in the church at Colossae. In the previous slides, we looked at the city of Colossae. Now we'll briefly examine the church at Colossae. The planting of the church at Colossae is not specifically mentioned in the book of Acts. Luke, the author of Acts, recorded that the entire province of Asia heard the gospel during Paul's 3 years of ministry in Ephesus. This is recorded in Acts chapter 19, verse 10, as it reads, "This went on for 2 years, so that all the residents of Asia, both Jews and Greeks, heard the word of the Lord." Most scholars think that the church at Colossae was founded at this time. However, Paul probably did not go to Colossae or Laodicea himself. We see this in Colossians 2, verse 1. "For I want you to know how greatly I am struggling for you, for those in Laodicea, and for all those who have not seen me in person." And here we have a map of the Asia Minor in the 1st century. Don't be confused. This is the modern day Turkey. So when they refer to Asia, Asia is a province. And Galatia is a province as well. Cappadocia, all the cities' names here, or the region names in capital letters, are provinces. not to be confused with today's Asia, which we consider China, North Korea, South Korea. But in the time of the first century, Asia was simply a province within the Anatolia, or the modern-day Turkey. This slide shows the three missionary journeys of Paul. Notice the church at Colossae was not on Paul's itinerary for any of his missionary trips. So if we look on the maps here, let's start with Paul's third missionary journey. Here we see Colossae, the city of Colossae, and notice it's not on the path for the cities that Paul did visit. On Paul's second missionary journey, again, Colossae is not on any of the cities that Paul visited. And again, on Paul's first missionary journey, the city of Colossae would be about here, and it's not on the path for any of the cities that Paul did visit. So from this we can conclude that Paul did not visit Colossae in any of his missionary trips, and that he did not therefore directly found the church at Colossae. There are several scenarios regarding the planting of the church at Colossae. Two of the major alternatives are presented in this slide. The first is one of Paul's associates, possibly Timothy, went into the regions of Laodicea and Colossae during the apostles' stay at Ephesus. Perhaps this is why Timothy's name is included in the greeting, and that's in Colossians chapter 1, verse 1. The second alternative, which is the preferred option, is that the residents of Laodicea and Colossae journeyed to Ephesus, were saved directly through Paul's ministry, and then returned to their hometowns and started churches there. These could have included Epaphras, Nympha, and Philemon. Since Paul had led Philemon to Christ and knew several in Colossae and Laodicea by name, Epaphras, Apphia, Nympha, and Archippus. The membership of the church at Colossae was composed largely, if not exclusively, of Gentiles. The disciples of these initial converts had never seen Paul, yet they looked to him for his apostolic direction. Paul was their spiritual grandfather. Paul's knowledge of their spiritual condition was secondhand. We see that in Colossians chapter 1, verses 4 and verse 8. This slide contains a short profile on Epaphras. The assembly at Colossae appeared to have been founded because of the evangelistic labors of Epaphras, who himself was a Colossian. We see that in Colossians 4, verse 12. Epaphras stood in intimate relation to the assembly. He had shown Paul their love in chapter 1, verse 8. He was a faithful minister of Christ on their behalf. We also see that in chapter 1, verse 7. It was from this distinguished servant of God that the Colossians had learned the gospel in its original simplicity. Epaphras is probably not the first name that comes to mind when we think of biblical characters, but he faithfully served Jesus, and his reward is sure. Just as those of us who are serving Jesus, our reward is sure. And we see this in Hebrews 6, verse 10. For God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love you demonstrated for his name by serving the saints and by continuing to serve them. Again, that's Hebrews chapter 6, verse 10. And note that all scriptures in this course will be presented using the Christian Standard Bible, or CSB, translation. We now move on to the final section of this lesson. Section 3 is focused on the overview, or actual contents of the letter. The overview includes the time and place of the writing, the purposes, just why did Paul write this letter, some of the letter distinctives, one of many outlines for the letter, and finally, some basic metrics associated with the letter to the Colossians. Time and place of the writing. Here is the setting. During Paul's absence from Asia Heresy began to infiltrate the area. The leaders of the church were apparently unable to cope with it, so they sent Epaphras to Rome to consult with Paul. Epaphras was the founder and pastor of the church. When he left, Archippus assumed the pastoral responsibilities. Epaphras informed Paul about the faith of the church, their love for Paul, and the heretical threat. And we see here that on the map that Epaphras was sent from Colossae to Rome where Paul was imprisoned. And we see here in Colossians 4:17, and tell Archippus, pay attention to the ministry you have received in the Lord, so that you can accomplish it. Unable to go to Colossae because of his imprisonment, Paul penned this epistle and sent it to the church through Tychicus and Onesimus. For some unknown reason, Epaphras was imprisoned along with Paul. Paul assured the church that Epaphras was laboring in his prayer ministry. Within 8 years of establishing the church, Paul had to warn this young church against the errors of the heresy. And we'll learn what that heresy is in a couple slides. I've shown on this slide here a thumbnail sketch of Tychicus and Onesimus. And I'll do a brief reading on this. Tychicus was a disciple employed by the Apostle Paul to carry his letters to several churches. He was with Paul during his first Roman imprisonment and was entrusted with the important mission of delivering the letters to the Ephesians and to the Colossians, with instructions to inform them of Paul's welfare and to encourage them. In the books of Ephesians and Colossians, he is praised by Paul as being a dear brother, a faithful servant / minister, and a fellow servant in the Lord. Now Onesimus, his thumbnail sketch here is, Onesimus was a servant or slave in whose behalf Paul wrote the epistle of Philemon. He was a native or inhabitant of Colossae. Onesimus had been a servant of Philemon, a Colossian Christian, but had run away from Colossae to Rome, which is where he met up with Paul. He may have even first robbed his master, which is Philemon, to make the journey. And the whole book of Philemon is about Paul pleading with Philemon to restore, to back and receive Onesimus as a fellow brother and servant. So just why did Paul write this letter to the Colossian believers? This slide presents 7 reasons why. First, to express his prayerful interest in the spiritual development of the believers, chapter 1, verses 1 through 12. To set forth the sovereign headship of Jesus Christ over creation and the church, chapter 1, verses 13 through 29. Third, to warn against the moral and doctrinal errors of the heresy, chapter 2, verses 1 to 23. And we'll see what the nature of the heresy is in the next couple of slides. 4. To exhort them to holiness, chapter 3, verses 1 through chapter 4, verse 6. 5. To explain the mission of both Tychicus and Onesimus, chapter 4, verses 7 through 9. 6. To send greetings from his associates, chapter 4, verses 10 to 15. And finally, number 7, to command the exchange of letters with the Laodicean church, chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. The origination of the heresy. Many Jews lived in the Colossae area because their ancestors were forced to migrate there under the Seleucid ruler Antiochus III. Their descendants eventually strayed away from Orthodox Judaism and succumbed to the influence of Greek philosophy. The heresy at Colossae did have a strong Jewish ritualistic character, whereas 2nd century Gnosticism manifested more the philosophical element. Here we see on the map The title here, Antiochus III resettled 2,000 Jewish families from Babylonia, which is Mesopotamia, into the Hellenistic or Greek Anatolian Turkey regions of Lydia and Phrygia. Lydia and Phrygia were provinces within Anatolia, which again is our modern day Turkey. It is difficult to determine whether these heretics developed and attacked from within or from outside the church. Paul earlier warned against both sources. We see this in Acts chapter 20, verses 29 and 30. 29 reads, I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. This is an example of an outside source attacking the church. In verse 30, men will rise up even from your own number and distort the truth to lure the disciples into following them. And this is an example of within the church source. Now, since the church was young and did have adequate leadership, it would seem the heresy came as an outside threat. So what exactly was this heresy? It taught that spiritual knowledge was available only to those with superior intellects, thus creating a spiritual caste system. And here on the slide on the right-hand side, I've got a little thumbnail sketch on the teachings of Gnosticism. And it reads, Gnostics claimed to be Christians, but Christians with a difference. They said that Jesus had two doctrines. One a doctrine fit for the common man and preached to everyone, and the other an advanced teaching, kept secret from the multitudes, fit only for the chosen few, the spiritually elite. And obviously they, the Gnostics, were the spiritually elite. And although the doctrines taught in the churches were not exactly wrong, and were in fact as close to the truth as the common man could hope to come, it was the Gnostics that one must turn to for real truth. And that is the nature of the heresy of Gnosticism. Why is Gnosticism rejected by the church? Faith was treated with contempt. Advanced Gnosticism even taught that salvation was received only by knowledge. Adherents believed they could understand divine mysteries totally unknown and unavailable to the typical Christian. This heresy also taught that all matter was innately evil and that the soul or mind was intrinsically good. It's referred to as radical dualism. This logically led to a denial of the creation of the material world by God and to a denial of the incarnation of Jesus Christ. The latter involved a repudiation of his humanity, his physical death, and his physical resurrection. And these are some of the bedrock tenets of the Christian faith, which is why Gnostic teachings are considered heretical. Gnostics have a complex angelic cosmogony. To explain the existence of the material world, the heretics taught that a series of angelic emanations created it. According to them, God created an angel, who created another angel, who in turn created another angel. This continued until the last angel in the series created the world. This angelic cosmogony thus denied God's direct creation and supervision of the world, resulting in some practical theological error. It stressed God's transcendence to the exclusion of his immanence. The transcendence of God is closely related to his sovereignty. God is above, other than, and distinct from all that he has made. He transcends it all. The immanence of God is to be within or near in relation to God's creation. Immanence is closely related to God's omnipresence, in that God is always present with the universe, though distinct from it. God is within the universe, in that God is its sustaining cause. To affirm God's transcendence and deny its immanence is to arrive at deism. To deny his transcendence and affirm his immanence is to arrive at pantheism. Since God did not create the world in the past, the heretics argued, he does not work in the world in the present. This ruled out the value of prayer and the possibility of miracles. It also led to a false worship of angels. If the world resulted from angelic emanations, then persons in the world had to work their way back to God through this series. Thus, they would have to know who those angels were and how many there were to give each his proper respect. Jesus Christ was reduced by most Gnostics into a creature, perhaps the highest being God created. This was an attack on the Trinity and on the eternal deity of Christ. So just what were the results of following this heresy? In daily living, this heresy led to asceticism and legalism. If matter is evil, then the body is evil. The heresy taught that to destroy the desires of the body, to satisfy the needs of the soul, a rigid code of behavior, including circumcision, dietary laws, and observances of feasts, had to be followed. And here is a definition of asceticism as an adjective: characterized by or suggesting the practice of severe self-discipline and abstinence from all forms of indulgence, typically for religious reasons. An ascetic life of prayer, fasting, and manual labor. We have examples of the rigid code of behavior, including Jewish circumcision, Jewish dietary laws, and the observance of Jewish feasts. In modern day examples of asceticism would be a Catholic priest and the vow of celibacy, and modern day monks. This overview distinctive slide shifts to the main theme of the book of Colossians, which is the preeminence of Christ. The Colossian epistle is priceless in its description of the person and work of Christ. The theme of the epistle is the preeminence of Christ. Nowhere else does Paul touch such heights on this theme. It is impossible to read this letter without realizing that Christ possesses a glory and station which can only move the soul to worship when the tremendous impact of the epistle reaches the mind. Colossians 1:15. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. And in future lessons we will be unpacking this major theme. Colossians contains a classic passage on the preeminence of Christ. Chapter 1, verses 15 through 22. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For everything was created by him in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and by him all things hold together. He is also the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile everything to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. His descriptive titles are unique: the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature or creature, the head of the body, the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. He is the creator and sustainer of the universe. In the natural and spiritual creations, Christ is sovereign and is entitled to preeminence. And what it means that God is sovereign, he answers to no one, to no creature. He is above all. This slide presents the Colossians' severe warning against unguided human intellect or non-biblical philosophy. Colossians 2:8. Be careful that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deceit based on human tradition, based on the elements of the world rather than Christ. A genuine love for wisdom should lead to a perfect love for Christ. Colossians 2:3. In him are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Many existing systems operating under the guise of philosophy are really governed by human standards, humanism, or anti-supernaturalism. They are not driven by an unbiased love of wisdom, nor by divine revelation centered in the person of Jesus Christ. Christians need to distinguish between true and false philosophies. And we see a little meme here: philosophy can ruin your life. This slide presents one of many outlines that could be found for the book of Colossians. This one is sourced from Irving L. Jensen in his Colossians and Philemon, a self-study guide. And we see here the focus of the book is Christ preeminent in all things. The major divisions are the four separate chapters: Christ supreme in the church, chapter 1, Christ supreme in the universe, chapter 2, Christ supreme in the home, chapter 3, Christ supreme in the community, chapter 4. The topics are broken down here as Christ, the head of the body, chapter 1, and deals with reconciliation. Christ, the head of the universe, dealing with creation. And Christ, the head of the home, contained in chapters 3 and 4. And the two major topics there: submission and conversation. The place where the book was written was a Roman prison that Paul was imprisoned in. The time was circa AD 60 to 62. The author is the Apostle Paul. And that's a brief overview of the book of Colossians in a simple tabular form. This is the final slide of the teaching portion of Lesson 1. It contains a simple descriptive statistical analysis on the book of Colossians. In here we see the book of Colossians has 4 chapters, 95 verses. The breakout on verses per chapter: chapter 1 has 29 verses, chapter 2 23 verses, chapter 3 25 verses, and chapter 4 18 verses. The total number of verses is 95, like I said up here, and the average is 23.8. The median is 24, which is almost spot on with the average. The minimum is 18, the maximum 29, the range is 11, and the range spread is 0.6, and the standard deviation is 4.6. That's your basic statistical analysis using descriptive statistics on the book of Colossians across all 4 of the chapters and the verses contained within each of those chapters. This section presents the Principal Application Table, or PAT, for this lesson. There will be a PAT for each lesson in the course. The intent of the PAT is to encourage the student to apply learned principles to their daily life. Lesson entries are not meant to be exhaustive, rather a small sample for motivation. This is the teacher-provided principal application table for this lesson. There are 4 principal rows sourced from the Bible teaching ministry of Pastor Chuck Swindoll. First principle: we have died with Christ. The application: we need to die to our sins. Second principle: we have been raised with Christ. The application: we must live well in Him and put on qualities that are motivated by Christian love. Third principle: Jesus is Lord over all. Application: our Christian life is a life of submission to Jesus the Christ. And the fourth principle, we should follow Jesus. Application. Our faith in Jesus Christ should transform the relationships we have in every area of our lives, in our homes, our churches, our communities, in our world. This section presents the lesson quiz for Lesson 1. For this lesson, I have provided a dozen quiz questions as a review for what we have covered. Number 1. Who wrote the book of Colossians? Question 2. Where was the book of Colossians written? Question 3. When was the book of Colossians written? 4. Is the evangelization of Colossae specifically mentioned in the book of Acts? 5. Who was the founder and pastor of the church at Colossae? 6. Who assumed pastoral responsibilities when Epaphras was sent to Rome? 7. Who was imprisoned with Paul in Rome? Philemon 1:23. What was the mixture of false teachings at Colossae? Why were so many Jews living in the Colossae area? Why did the Gnostics teach regarding spiritual knowledge? 11. What is the theme of the Colossian epistle? And number 12. What are the warnings presented in Colossians? This section presents the lesson study questions for Lesson 1. These are more reflective questions intended for the student to ponder and reflect on their walk with Christ. I have provided 5 study questions, some of which have sub-questions. Feel free to reflect on any or all of the questions provided. These questions were sourced from the Bickle and Janes study guide, shown here. Question number 1. Why was Paul so concerned about the spiritual beliefs of the people in Colossae, most of whom he had never met? Number 2. Paul wasn't worried that the Colossians would switch religions. His concern was that they'd adopt some screwy ideas or views under the mistaken impression that the false teachings were doctrines of Christianity. Review what you know about Colossian heresy, and what are some of the ways that people try to bend the truth of Christianity today. 3. Can all religions be correct? Hint. Each major religion of the world contends that its doctrine is the truth and that the other religions are wrong. How can a study of Colossians be helpful to you in combating the false notions of religious pluralism? Number 4. Make a checklist of the things that you believe about Christ. Make this list as exhaustive as possible. Save this list and review it when you have completed your study of Colossians to see if your understanding of Christ has changed. And finally, number 5. The Christians in Colossae were entertaining beliefs of other people. What does this fact suggest to you about 1. The importance of selecting your friends, and 2. The importance of knowing what you believe? That concludes Lesson 1 of our Colossians course. The next lesson, Lesson 2, is entitled The Giving of Thanks, and it will cover the first 8 verses of Colossians chapter 1. This slide presents the course syllabus, which indicates we have completed Lesson 1, and we are moving on to Lesson 2, The Giving of Thanks, Colossians 1, 1 through 8.